Hello, and welcome. Imagine standing on a quiet Swedish hillside at sunrise. The air feels fresh and cool. The beautiful landscape stretches out for miles. For many of us, Sweden brings a feeling of calm and peace. We often picture Swedish people as quite similar to each other. Tall, fair-haired, with strong Viking roots that feel almost like a legend. But hidden beneath this peaceful image is a much more interesting story. It is written not in old tales or stone, but inside the DNA found in ancient bones. When scientists carefully studied the DNA from these old bones across Sweden and Scandinavia, they found something truly surprising. Recent large studies, including one important research paper in the journal Cell that looked at nearly 300 ancient Scandinavian genomes going back more than 2,000 years, are changing what we thought we knew about Northern European history. The picture is not simple or uniform. It shows many layers, waves of people moving in, unexpected mixing, and a quiet strength that has shaped the Swedish people over thousands of years. So, today, we are going to explore this fascinating genetic story together. We will start with the very first people who arrived after the Great Ice Age. Then we will look at the changes brought by early farmers and Bronze Age herders. We will see the busy Viking Age, when genetic diversity became much greater than expected. And finally, we will discover how the gene pool later returned to a more stable balance. It is a journey that challenges old ideas and invites us to think about the hidden stories in our own ancestry. So, to understand these surprises, let us travel far back in time, to a world still recovering from the last ice age, when the first humans began to settle in Sweden. Chapter 1. The Deep Foundations, Sweden's earliest inhabitants. Around 12,000 years ago, the great ice sheets that covered much of the north began to melt. As the ice disappeared, the land slowly woke up and became livable again. It was during this time that the first people started moving into the area we now call Sweden. These first arrivals were hunter-gatherers. They were skilled and strong men and women who followed herds of reindeer, fished in the rich coastal waters, and learned how to live in a world that was changing very quickly. Scientists call them Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, or SHGs for short. Their genes created the early foundation for what would later become Swedish ancestry. But what has surprised many researchers is that these early groups did not all come from the same direction. They arrived through two quite different migration routes. One group came from Western and Central Europe. Another group brought connections from the Eastern Baltic regions. So, instead of everyone simply moving from south to north, this created a surprising pattern that scientists call a genetic crisscross. Sometimes, people living on the western coast of Sweden had stronger genetic links to populations in the east, and sometimes it was the other way around. So, in simple terms, where people lived on the map did not always match what their DNA showed. One very touching discovery comes from a place called Ajvide on the island of Gotland. About 5,500 years ago, people there buried their dead together in shared graves. So, when scientists studied the bones, they found that many of the individuals were closely related. They were second or even third-degree relatives, such as cousins or aunts and uncles. And these were not random graves. They were family groupings. This tells us that even these ancient hunter-gatherers kept strong extended family networks. They had a deep understanding of their family lines and passed that knowledge down through the generations. So, these early layers of Swedish DNA show us something important and impressive: how well humans can adapt to difficult conditions. Because at that time, the climate was still unstable. The forests were young and new, and food sources were spread out. Life was hard. Yet these people did not just survive. They adapted successfully and left a strong genetic mark that is still part of Sweden today. And even in modern Swedish people, a significant part of their DNA can be traced back to these tough and resilient Scandinavian hunter-gatherers. Their story forms the quiet, solid base beneath everything that came later. But the story does not stop with these hunter-gatherers. Soon, new waves of people began to arrive. They brought different ways of living and new genetic material that would continue to shape the Swedish gene pool in important ways. Chapter 2. Waves of change, farmers, steppe herders, and Bronze Age transformations. So, as the centuries passed, new groups of people began arriving in Scandinavia. They brought fresh ideas, new tools and ways of living, and new genetic material that would slowly change both the land and the people who lived there. The first big change came with the Neolithic farmers. Around 6,000 years ago, they moved northward from Central Europe, and some of these farmers had family roots that went back to the Mediterranean area. They introduced farming, growing crops, and keeping animals like cows and sheep. They also brought a more settled way of life. So, over time, they turned large areas of wild forest into open fields for growing food. And later, during the Bronze Age, another important group arrived. These were people connected to the Yamnaya herders who lived on the wide grasslands of the Eurasian steppe. They were skilled with animals and brought new metalworking skills, different burial customs, and a strong genetic signature that would become very common in Northern Europe. So today, the average Swedish person has a special mix of ancestry. It is roughly 40 to 50% from the steppe herders, a good amount from the early farmers, and a lasting part from the ancient hunter-gatherers we talked about in the last chapter. But however, these percentages are not exactly the same everywhere in Sweden. Different regions show slightly different mixes, and this reminds us that even inside one country, history left its own unique marks in different places. But here is something interesting. When different cultures met, it did not always mean one group completely replaced another genetically. A good example is the pitted-ware hunter-gatherer groups. They started using some of the pottery styles and burial practices from the new battle-axe farming culture, and this suggests they were trading goods and sharing ideas with the newcomers. But when scientists looked closely at their DNA, these hunter-gatherer groups stayed genetically quite separate and similar among themselves. It seems people were happy to exchange knowledge and objects, but large-scale mixing of whole populations happened much more slowly. And in this way, Sweden's genetic story follows the bigger changes that were happening across Europe at the same time. But it also shows a special kind of northern strength and resilience, the ability to take in new influences while still keeping important parts of the earlier ancestry alive. And these early changes prepared the ground for one of the most exciting and surprising periods in Scandinavian history, the Viking Age. During this time, genetic diversity grew much greater than scientists had expected. Chapter 3. The Viking Age Surprise. Greater diversity than expected. So now, when we reach the Viking Age, from about 750 to 1050 CE, Scandinavia was no longer a quiet northern land. It became a busy center of travel, trade, and meeting between different peoples. And this brought a surprising new wave of genetic diversity to Sweden and the surrounding areas. Scientists studying ancient DNA have found clear evidence of this change. During this period, a lot of new ancestry flowed into the region. Genes from the British and Irish Isles became very common, probably brought home by Vikings who had traveled there and returned. There were also stronger influences from the eastern Baltic areas, especially in central Sweden and on the island of Gotland. Some people even showed genetic connections that reached as far as southern Europe. The Vikings themselves were much more genetically mixed than the usual picture of tall, fair-haired warriors. Their looks varied a lot, and their family backgrounds were often a blend of different groups. Because, in Viking burial sites, researchers have found people buried with typical Viking items, such as weapons, jewelry, and even ships. But their DNA showed they were not originally from Scandinavia. And this shows that the Viking world was far more varied and connected with many different peoples than many people once thought. Swedish Vikings had especially close contacts with the Baltic regions. One clear example comes from boat burials in Estonia. 4 brothers were buried together in one boat. And when scientists studied their DNA, they found the brothers belonged to a close local group, but the wider population around them showed signs of much broader mixing. Some individuals even carried small traces of ancestry from areas toward Asia or Slavic regions. This gives us a picture of wide-reaching family and travel networks. So, this genetic diversity challenges the romantic idea of a completely pure Viking world. It shows how raids, trade, peaceful settlement, and sometimes the harsher realities of enslavement all helped shape how genes moved during this active time. The Viking Age created a peak in genetic variety that many scientists did not expect at all. Yet what happened after this time turned out to be just as interesting. After all this mixing, the Swedish gene pool showed a surprising kind of strength. It quietly bounced back toward its earlier patterns. Chapter 4. The Post-Viking Bounce Back. Why the Gene Pool Reset. So, after the busy mixing during the Viking Age, one of the biggest surprises appeared. The outside ancestry that had come in, from the British and Irish Isles, the eastern Baltic areas, and other places, reached its highest level during Viking times and the early Middle Ages. But however, in modern Swedish people today, these outside genetic contributions are often much lower than scientists had expected. It seems the Swedish gene pool largely bounced back toward its older pre-Viking patterns. Scientists have suggested a few possible reasons for this quiet return. The new groups that arrived may have had fewer children who survived and had families of their own over many generations. Or it could be that the local Scandinavian people simply had more children and contributed more to the future family lines. However, we may not know every detail, but the result was clear. The gene pool showed a remarkable ability to return to its earlier foundations. And even today, clear differences still exist across different parts of Sweden. In the northern areas, people often have closer genetic connections to Finns. They also show small, ancient influences linked to the Sami people. These include very old traces from Siberian-related ancestry, which adds an extra deep Arctic layer to the story. While in the southern parts of Sweden, people tend to share more genetic similarities with populations in Germany and Britain. And the island of Gotland, as we saw earlier, still has its own special and distinct genetic character. So, this kind of resilience raises interesting questions. It makes us think about how populations grow and change, about social structures and family life, and about the quiet ways genes can continue or slowly fade across hundreds of years. It reminds us that human history is not shaped only by big, dramatic movements of people. It is also shaped by steady, often invisible forces that decide who contributes the most to the next generations. These discoveries from Sweden's long past do more than just update old history books. They invite us to stop and think about what they mean for how we understand our own identity and the shared story of all human beings. Chapter 5. Deeper Layers and Ongoing Mysteries. As we look even deeper into the past, we find that the surprises in Swedish DNA go back much further than the Viking Age. Even long before the Vikings, the northern lands were never completely cut off from the rest of the world. The DNA already carried small, faint traces of ancestry from outside the area. Some of these traces pointed toward early connections with Asia, while others linked to southern European roots. These quiet signs remind us that movement and contact between different groups have been shaping this region for thousands of years. Ancient DNA also helps us feel closer to real people who lived long ago. In some cases, scientists have found interesting links between characters mentioned in Old Norse sagas and actual bones they have studied. For example, the Well Man, a figure from medieval stories, has connections to real human remains. These bones confirm old regional differences, such as stronger ties to southern Norway, that we can still see in today's population patterns. And beyond these individual stories, ancient DNA shows us the complex realities of family and social life in the past. We see examples of large extended family networks in Stone Age burials, just like the ones we learned about at Ajvide on Gotland. We also learn that ideas and culture often spread faster than genes. New ways of doing things, new tools, and new customs could travel quickly through trade or simple contact between groups. But the actual mixing of whole populations usually happened more slowly and in uneven ways. These discoveries gently remind us that real history is often messier and more connected than simple stories suggest. The Swedish gene pool was never a closed or separate story. It has always been a living story of adaptation, connection between people, and quiet, steady continuity. All of this leads us to a deeper question. What does this long, layered genetic journey really mean for how we understand ourselves and our shared human past? Chapter 6. What it all means. Reflections on identity and human history. So what does all of this mean? Well, at its heart, the Swedish DNA story is not about purity or everyone being exactly the same. It is a story of repeated mixing, impressive adaptation, and a quiet strength that has helped people survive ice ages, big movements of populations, and hundreds of years of change. The gene pool has taken in new influences many times, but it has also kept some deep, old foundations that we can still see today. These discoveries are quietly changing how we understand European history and the history of all human beings. Ancient DNA gently questions old ideas about fixed peoples or bloodlines that never change. Instead, it shows a shared human story woven together from countless journeys of migration and survival. No group of people has ever stayed completely still or separate. And for many of us watching this video, this may bring a personal moment of reflection. Perhaps you have taken an Ancestry DNA test yourself, or maybe you have heard family stories passed down through the generations. You might now see those stories differently, as part of this bigger, connected human journey that crosses countries and centuries. There is a quiet feeling of wonder in all of this. Science keeps finding new layers every year. It invites us to look at the past with humility and curiosity. We are reminded that behind every piece of DNA is a real person who lived, loved, adapted to their world, and contributed to the future in ways they could never have imagined. So, in the end, the Swedish DNA that surprised scientists gives us something valuable. It gives us a deeper appreciation for the hidden stories written in our genes, and for the rich, shared humanity that connects all of us. Conclusion. As we come to the end of this journey, let's quietly think back on what we have discovered together. We started with the very first people after the Ice Age. 2 different migration routes created a surprising genetic crisscross across the land. We saw how waves of farmers and steppe herders added new layers to the DNA. Then came the Viking Age, when genetic diversity reached an unexpected high point through contacts with the British Isles, the Baltic region, and beyond. One of the most interesting surprises was the gene pool's quiet bounce back toward its earlier patterns. At the same time, clear regional differences still remain in Sweden today, from the North's closer ties to Finland and the Sami people, to the special and distinct character of Gotland. The Swedish DNA did not just surprise scientists. It invites all of us to look at human history with fresh eyes and with greater appreciation for the hidden stories written in our genes. So, if this video stirred something in you, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Which parts surprised you the most? Have you found unexpected results in your own ancestry tests or family stories? Sharing your experiences helps all of us understand the bigger picture. And if you enjoyed this calm and thoughtful look at science and history, please consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell. There is much more to explore together. Stories about ancient DNA, human strength and resilience, and the fascinating journeys that connect us all across time and place. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, take care.